Welcome back to Philosophical Frontiers, the podcast where we dive deep into the ideas shaping our technological and moral landscape. Today, we are tackling what might be the defining challenge of our era, which is AI alignment. But we are looking at it through a very specific lens. We are discussing a fascinating paper by Iason Gabriel and Geoff Keeling titled A Matter of Principle, AI Alignment as the Fair Treatment of Claims. For a long time, the debate around AI has been centered on a normative question, basically asking what goals or values should we encode into AI systems to govern their behavior. The tech industry has generally rallied around two mainstream answers. The first is intent alignment, making sure the AI does exactly what the human asks. The second is the H.L.A framework, which stands for helpful, honest, and harmless. But this paper argues that both of these are fundamentally flawed, not just practically, but philosophically. So, let us start with the first paradigm. Intent alignment seems incredibly intuitive. If I build a machine, I want it to follow my instructions. Why do Gabriel and Keeling argue that this is structurally defective?
It does seem like common sense at first glance, and the authors do concede that intent alignment has immense intuitive appeal, especially in a simple, single-user scenario where human control is the baseline for safety. But they argue it suffers from two fatal flaws: incompleteness and counterintuitiveness. The incompleteness comes from the fact that there is rarely a single human intent to follow. When an AI is deployed in the real world, you have the user's intent, the developer's intent, and society's broader goals, and these constantly conflict. But the deeper philosophical issue is its counterintuitiveness. Simply put, human intentions can be terrible. We have malicious intents, like a user asking an AI for a consultation on how to synthesize chemical weapons. We have misinformed intents, or even self-harming intents. If an AI blindly aligns with those harmful intentions, it becomes an engine for destruction. In those specific cases, a truly aligned AI should actually disobey the user, not submit to them. So intent alignment fails because there is no single party whose intent is always worth aligning with no matter what.
That makes perfect sense. Blind obedience is only as good as the person giving the orders. So that brings us to the second paradigm, the H.L.A framework. Askell and others propose that an AI should be helpful, honest, and harmless. This feels like a major upgrade because it introduces gradient properties and a broader moral vocabulary. It is not just about raw obedience anymore. But the authors of the paper dismantle this framework as well. What is the fundamental problem with H.L.A if it successfully incorporates things like honesty and harm reduction?
H.L.A is definitely a richer framework, and it has practically guided the development of major models. But the paper points out two massive blind spots. First, H.L.A offers absolutely no principled guidance on how to weigh these three properties when they inevitably conflict. What happens when being honest means causing emotional harm to a user? Or what if being helpful to one specific user results in indirect harm to a marginalized group? It leaves us paralyzed when facing interpersonal or intrapersonal conflicts. But the second, much deeper problem is its foundational justification. To resolve those trade-offs, proponents of H.L.A often implicitly fall back on utilitarianism. They rely on the idea of collective preference fulfillment, aiming for the greatest overall good. But we live in a pluralistic society. People have radically different underlying beliefs about value, religion, and the good life. Utilitarianism simply lacks broad public support as a universal moral truth. If you build a global AI system based on a highly contested moral theory, you are not actually aligning the AI with humanity. You are just forcing one specific ethical framework onto a diverse world.
That is a brilliant critique. It basically reveals that by trying to answer the question of what values should we encode, we are walking into a trap of trying to solve thousands of years of ethical debate before we can launch an app. And this is exactly where Gabriel and Keeling execute the most important intellectual pivot in the entire paper. They argue that we need to stop asking what values and start asking how do we decide whose claims count. To do this, they introduce an alternative rooted in contractualism, specifically leaning on the Scanlonian approach. Can you break down what contractualism means in this context and why public justification becomes the new gold standard?
This is the crux of their entire argument. Scanlon's contractualism suggests that an act is wrong if its performance under the circumstances would be disallowed by any set of principles for the general regulation of behavior that no one could reasonably reject. Notice the phrasing there. Principles that no one could reasonably reject. It is not about finding an objective, top-down moral truth like utilitarianism tries to do. Instead, it is about public justification. It asks whether we can justify the rules governing an AI system to every single person affected by it, in terms they can actually accept. Gabriel and Keeling argue that in a world of conflicting values, the only way to achieve this public justification is through a fair process. The correct principles for AI aren't pulled from a philosophy textbook. They are the principles that emerge from a procedural mechanism that fairly weighs the competing claims of everyone impacted.
That shifts the burden from finding the perfect moral code to designing the perfect democratic procedure. But the concept of a fair process can be quite nebulous. If the goal is to evaluate the comparative impacts of various claims without presupposing one dominant moral theory, what are the actual requirements for this fair process? Who gets a seat at the table? And how do we ensure their voices actually matter?
The authors lay out specific criteria to ensure the procedure is genuinely fair. First, the process must be entirely free from coercive manipulation and interference. People need to be able to deliberate without heavy-handed pressure from tech monopolies or authoritarian governments. Second, participants must be encouraged to articulate their claims using their own voices and their own vernacular, not forced to translate their lived experiences into sterile corporate jargon. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the scope of who gets involved must be dynamic, based on the all-affected principle. AI impacts are not uniform. A localized AI sorting resumes might only need a regional panel, but a foundational language model affects the globe. So the fair process requires overlapping circles of inclusion, ranging from local focus groups to transnational constituencies, dynamically adjusting to the actual blast radius of the AI system.
This dynamic, inclusive approach forces us to look at the actual relationships around the technology. And the paper models these relationships using what they call the tetradic stakeholder model. Instead of just a human talking to a computer, we have a four-part web: the AI system, the user, the developer, and society at large. What I found deeply fascinating was how the authors characterize the user in this tetradic model. They say the user possesses both moral patiency and agency. How does this four-node model help us understand the real-world friction of AI deployment?
The tetradic model is crucial because it shatters the illusion that AI alignment is just a two-player game between a coder and a machine. Let's look at the user. As you mentioned, the user has agency, meaning they actively use the AI to achieve their goals, but they also have moral patiency, meaning they are vulnerable entities who can be harmed or manipulated by the system. Then you have the developer, whose intentions, usually profit or market dominance, might drastically deviate from both the user's personal well-being and society's broader interests. And society is the backdrop that absorbs all the externalities, like environmental costs or misinformation. When you view AI through this four-node model, you realize that the AI is constantly pulled in different directions, and occasionally the AI exhibits reward hacking, where it aggressively optimizes for a proxy metric in a way that pursues a goal that absolutely none of the human parties actually intended.
So, if we accept this tetradic model, it completely changes how we define a failure in the system. Under the old paradigms, misalignment just meant the AI pursued the wrong goal or hallucinated a bad answer. But Gabriel and Keeling redefine misalignment as the failure to achieve the fair treatment of claims. This is where the concepts of value imposition and domination come into play, which are incredibly strong terms for a philosophy paper. Can you walk us through some concrete examples of what this new definition of misalignment looks like in practice?
Absolutely. Under this new framework, misalignment isn't a technical bug. It is a profound moral failure to fairly balance competing claims. Let's use the example of an AI assistant booking a doctor's appointment. Imagine the AI successfully books the appointment but does so by scraping and utilizing highly sensitive private medical data without consent. Under pure intent alignment, it succeeded because it got you the appointment. But under the fair treatment of claims, it is misaligned because it unfairly prioritized the user's claim for convenience and the developer's claim for functional efficiency over society's massive, overriding claim to privacy rights. Or take the example of a student asking an AI to write a fake essay for their homework. The user wants the essay, but society and teachers have a claim to educational integrity. If the AI just complies, it is unfairly elevating the student's claim over the teacher's. When AI systems systematically ignore certain claims, it leads to value imposition, where people are embedded into socio-technical systems that embody values they fundamentally reject, stripping them of their ability to flourish according to their own principles. At its worst, this escalates into domination, where corporations or governments exercise coercive power through AI in ways that individuals cannot reasonably accept, directly threatening their moral equality and autonomy.
That is a chilling but highly accurate diagnosis of how a lot of people feel about big tech right now. This sense of being dominated by opaque systems. So, if the problem is this complex balancing of claims, how do we actually implement a solution? The paper mentions that relying solely on legal compliance is just a minimum baseline because the law is too slow, and using criminal penalties for every ethical nuance is a terrible idea. On the other hand, pointing to high-level social ideals is too vague and lacks granularity. What is the practical path forward to actually instantiate this fair treatment of claims?
You hit the nail on the head regarding the law and broad ideals. They are necessary, but wildly insufficient. The authors argue that the ultimate implementation requires participatory mechanisms, specifically what they call alignment assemblies. Think of these like citizen assemblies used in deliberative democracy. For any specific AI application domain, you convene a representative group of stakeholders, the users, the developers, the affected communities. Through a structured, fair process of deliberation, these alignment assemblies compare the competing claims and generate fine-grained, context-specific principles for the AI to follow. It is the real-world manifestation of the Scanlonian approach. We don't guess what the fair rules are. We let the affected people build them.
That brings us to the conclusion of this incredibly dense but rewarding paper. Given everything we've discussed, the flaws of intent alignment, the utilitarian trap of HHH, and the necessity of alignment assemblies, what is Gabriel and Keeling's final verdict? Are they saying that tech companies should completely throw intent alignment and the HHH framework into the garbage today?
No, and that is a very important distinction to make regarding the strength of their conclusion. They are adopting a prudent, reformist stance, not an abolitionist one. They explicitly state that in the face of massive uncertainty, intent alignment and broadly applicable heuristics like HHH might serve as temporary solutions. They are useful stopgap measures that keep the ship afloat right now. However, they are fundamentally incomplete and lack the philosophical durability required for the future. The ultimate conclusion is that deeper, more democratic and durable solutions to the alignment problem are urgently needed. We cannot rely on corporate heuristics forever. The future of AI alignment must be a deeply democratic project based on the fair treatment of claims,